Welcome to the Labor Force Podcast, where we talk about the rise of labor militancy and the fact that capitalism is a rotten deal. I'm your host, Mike Strukin, proud member of New York State United Teachers. Well, of course, yesterday was May Day, and we had thousands of people across the country in coordinated May Day protests organized under the May Day Strong Ban, staging what organizers called an economic blackout with the message no work, no school, no shopping. The demonstrations, which spanned more than 3,500 events nationwide, were led by a coalition of labor unions, immigrant rights groups, and progressive organizations, aiming to draw attention to issues like wealth inequality, immigration enforcement, and workers' rights. The protests included a wide range of actions, from marches and rallies to direct disruptions, such as protesters chaining themselves to the New York Stock Exchange.
We want to show you still, these two protesters over here are still chained to each other. There's a slew of NYPD in front of them, but you have protesters chained to each other. Right over there is a journalist that they've detained. I don't know why, because she's just covering the event. And to your right, you see 5 protesters, including one with a nose clown, locked arms in front of that entrance. They got confetti too. And there also are protesters down to our left, blocking the entrance. So this is well organized. I would say there's maybe 24 protesters involved. Yeah, we could show over here more cops are arriving. So they're basically trying first to figure out how to get the folks that are chaining themselves to unchain, and now they're heading over to this entrance that is blocked by about 8 or 9, over a dozen protesters.
We also had demonstrations at major corporate sites like Amazon offices. Workers, students, and teachers played a significant role, with widespread participation even forcing school closures in some areas, highlighting the scale of the movement. Organizers framed the demonstrations as a show of collective power and solidarity, emphasizing broader goals such as challenging systemic economic inequality and pushing for social and labor reforms. The May Day actions were also positioned as a step toward a larger ambition, a potential nationwide general strike in the future, underscoring a growing movement seeking to translate protest into sustained economic pressure. And as we know, the need to keep up sustained pressure from the bottom up couldn't be greater, because wouldn't you know it?
But we begin with the war in Iran tonight, what President Trump is now saying tonight as gas prices here in the U.S. hit a new high since this war began. Now $4.40 a gallon, even higher in some parts of the country. Elizabeth Schulze leading us off.
Tonight, the cost of the war with Iran surging fast and straining the budgets of American families and businesses. Drivers are now paying an average of $4.40 a gallon, up 35 cents in just the last week, and $1.46 since the start of the war, the highest price in 4 years.
Having to choose between gas and food, and that's a very hard decision.
President Trump today asked about gas prices.
The average price of a gallon of gas is now $4.30 in this country.
And you know what? And we're not going to have a nuclear weapon in the hands of Iran. The gas will go down. As soon as the war's over, it'll drop like a rock.
But tonight, gas prices are climbing in every state, surging fastest in the Great Lakes, Illinois, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Michigan. These drivers protesting outside Detroit.
I have family members who are ill, and I can't go visit them across the state or up north because it's too expensive right now to drive.
It couldn't come at a worse time for consumers who are gearing up for the summer travel season.
The nation's highest prices in California, where gas now averages $6 a gallon, even more at some stations.
It's kind of shocking at this point how much we're paying for this.
Our Jacqueline Lee is in Los Angeles outside a Costco gas station.
Drivers here are on the hunt for the cheapest gas, willing to wait in long lines like these to save money.
The cost of diesel, which powers trucks and tractors carrying goods across the country, is up by almost $2 a gallon. Jessica Woods co-owns a grocery store in Washington, D.C. She says fuel surcharges on her food deliveries have more than doubled, forcing her to raise prices.
How hard is that decision for you to say, we're going to have to pass down the costs to shoppers?
Incredibly hard. But ultimately, if we're going to keep the lights on, we do have to charge as much as we pay.
It's just math.
Yeah, exactly.
David, the president says gas prices will drop like a rock, but even if the Strait reopens tomorrow, analysts say it could take a year for gas to get back to its pre-war levels. David?
Affecting a lot of people. Elizabeth Schulze leading us off here. Thank you.
I mean, on and on it goes. A recent survey by Gallup found that 55% of respondents view their personal financial situation as getting worse, a new high dating back to 2001. The polling, released Tuesday, was conducted from April 1st to the 15th for the firm's annual Economy and Personal Finance Survey. It asked respondents questions on their personal financial situations, the most important financial problems they face, and how price increases are impacting them, among other queries. The percentage of those who said their personal financial situation is getting worse is higher than the previous high of 53% set last April. The prior high mark was 50%, which was set twice, during the COVID pandemic in April 2020 and amid high inflation in April 2023. So if you felt like the U.S. economy was already a little unsteady, you weren't imagining it, and now with the war involving Iran and the disruption in global energy flows, that shakiness is starting to look like something more serious. Today I want to walk through what's happening, why it matters beyond the price you see at the gas pump, and why the next few months could be economically and politically tense heading into the midterm elections in November. Let's start with the event that's driving so much of this. Again, Iran's move to effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz after U.S. and Israeli strikes earlier this year. Even with a short ceasefire, shipping through that narrow passage hasn't bounced back the way many hoped it would. And because that strait's a critical choke point for the world economy, the result is the global supply shock that could end up being even more disruptive than what the world experienced during Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. So why is the Strait of Hormuz such a big deal? Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil shipments normally move through it. But it's not just oil. Fertilizer inputs, liquefied natural gas, and even helium used in advanced manufacturing depend on that route too. So when traffic through Hormuz dries up, the impact shows up in many places at once. Energy, food, manufacturing, transportation, and ultimately inflation. The quickest pain is landed in Asia. More than 80% of the oil that usually passes through the strait is headed that way. That's forced real practical adjustments. Fuel-saving rules, shorter work weeks in some countries, factories slowing down, even school closures in places where the energy crunch is severe. And it's not only poorer countries feeling it. Higher-income economies have also started pushing conservation. That's how you know it's not a small disruption. Now you might be thinking, the U.S. produces a lot of oil, and it exports more than it imports. So why should Americans care? Because in a globally priced commodity market, a shock overseas doesn't stay overseas. U.S. drivers, as we've said, are already seeing it in higher gas prices, with average prices moving above $4 a gallon in many areas and rising sharply in a short period of time. And crucially, that's likely not the end of it. Supply disruptions like this ripple outward and take time to fully work through the system. And here's the part that tends to get missed in day-to-day conversation. Higher oil prices don't just mean more expensive fill-ups. They filter into airline tickets, shipping costs, and the prices of goods that rely on petroleum-based materials, like many plastics. They also push up the cost of imported products because it costs more to move things around the world. So even people who barely drive can end up paying more. Food is another pressure point. Fertilizers and inputs used to produce it are affected by this supply shock, and farmers who didn't already buy and store what they needed are now dealing with significantly higher costs. That can raise food prices, both for products grown with imported fertilizer and for food produced domestically, because the cost structure of farming changes. And if fertilizer is short mid-season, you can't just fix that overnight. Some of this damage is essentially locked in for months ahead. Even if the Strait fully reopens tomorrow, and the fighting stops, the economy wouldn't instantly snap back. Infrastructure in the Gulf has been hit, and repairs can take years. Supply chains don't reorganize in a week. Markets don't calmly reset on command. That's why the risk is not just a temporary spike, but a longer period where growth slows while prices stay uncomfortably high. That brings us to one of the most worrying possibilities economists talk about, stagflation. That's the ugly combination of rising prices and weak or stagnant growth. It's difficult because the usual tools to fight inflation can weaken growth even more, and the usual tools to boost growth can make inflation worse. In other words, it can put policymakers in a bind. Inflation is already moving in the wrong direction. A big jump in gas prices has recently helped push inflation higher, rising noticeably from February to March. And the measures that strip out volatile food and energy costs, so-called core inflation, are still running above the Federal Reserve's long-term goal. The key point isn't just a single month's number. It's that the supply shock from the conflict has only begun to spread through the broader economy. That means future inflation readings could climb higher as higher costs work their way into everything from transportation to groceries to manufactured goods. Some forecasters are warning that inflation in 2026 could rise to levels that would feel like a real setback after years when Americans were already frustrated by higher prices. And that's where economics turn political fast. Voters have been telling pollsters for a long time that affordability is one of their top concerns. You can have a strong stock market or a decent GDP number, but if people feel like everyday life is getting more expensive, that dominates the conversation. What about jobs? The picture is mixed. Recent job reports have been choppy month to month, but overall the unemployment rate's been holding fairly steady, and hiring has shown signs of stabilizing into what you might call a lower hire, lower fire environment. That sounds calm, but it can also mean the economy is less dynamic, with fewer new opportunities opening up. There's also specific anxieties that don't always show up immediately in the headline data. One is job displacement tied to AI adoption. Another is visible layoffs at major tech companies, which can shape perceptions far beyond the tech sector itself. And there's a very real concern among new college graduates that entry-level roles are harder to land, which can have a lasting effect on household formation, spending, and confidence. Confidence is actually one of the biggest storylines here. Consumer confidence has dropped sharply, hitting extremely low levels in widely watched surveys. When consumers are pessimistic, they tend to pull back, delay big purchases, travel less, and generally spend more cautiously. That can slow growth on its own, even before any official recession shows up. Business confidence has been more complicated. Earlier in the year, many business leaders were sounding fairly upbeat, especially at larger firms. But that optimism was measured before the conflict escalated in February. Since then, uncertainty has piled up, and businesses hate uncertainty because it makes long-term planning that much harder. One major source of that uncertainty has been trade policy. Court decisions have thrown into question the durability of certain tariffs, while emergency measures have expiration dates and unclear legal futures. If you're a company trying to decide whether to rebuild a supply chain, shift production to a new country, or invest in a new U.S. manufacturing hub, you want predictable rules. When the rules might change again in a few months, the rational move is often to wait. And when lots of businesses wait, investment slows. Now let's talk about the Federal Reserve and interest rates, because this is where the policy choices get tricky. After cutting rates toward the end of last year, the Fed has recently kept rates where they are. With inflation risk rising again, it becomes harder to justify near-term rate cuts. The Fed is likely to sit back and watch how this shock spreads beyond fuel into the broader basket of prices people pay every day. The core challenge is the Fed's dual mandate, keeping inflation under control while also supporting maximum employment. If inflation is rising because of an oil-driven supply shock, but growth is slowing and unemployment starts creeping up, the Fed can get pulled in two directions. Cut rates to support jobs and you might add fuel to inflation. Keep rates high to fight inflation, and you might worsen a slowdown. There are no easy answers in that scenario. There's another risk too, expectations. If consumers and workers start to believe inflation will stay high for years, those expectations can influence wage demands and pricing decisions. That's how inflation can become self-reinforcing through a wage-price spiral dynamic. Policymakers watch this closely because once expectations shift, it can be much harder to bring inflation back down without significant economic pain. So where does that leave growth? It's worth remembering that the U.S. economy did grow solidly in 2025, even after a period of tariff-related turbulence. Compared with other major advanced economies, U.S. growth was relatively strong. But the Hormuz disruption and the broader conflict risk changing the trajectory, not necessarily by wiping out growth overnight, but by increasing the odds of a slowdown while prices remain elevated. And globally, there are warnings that if conditions don't improve, recession risk can rise. Housing is one more area where these pressures show up in everyday life. Before the conflict escalated, there were some hopeful signs, including mortgage rates dipping below 6% for the first time in a while, and legislative momentum aimed at boosting housing supply and limiting certain investor activity in single-family homes. But now with inflation higher and rate cuts less likely, mortgage rates have moved back up again, and that of course makes affordability worse. And affordability is already the central housing problem. The country has a massive shortfall in the number of homes available, on the order of millions. When you combine a deep housing shortage with higher borrowing costs, you get a market where buyers feel squeezed, renters feel stuck, and political pressure builds. With elections approaching, all this becomes even more charged. Approval of the administration's economic handling is low, and the response so far has included releasing oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve and discussing temporary relief measures, like reducing the federal gas tax. Those steps might help in the margin in the short term, but they don't rebuild damaged infrastructure, they don't replace missing fertilizer supplies mid-season, and they don't fully restore the confidence of consumers and businesses, rattled by an extended geopolitical shock. So the big takeaway is this. The Iran war and the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz are not just foreign policy headlines. They're economic events that can shape inflation, growth, jobs, housing, and the mood of voters. And because the shock touches energy, food, and shipping all at once, it has the potential to linger even if the fighting cools down. So over the next few months, watch a few indicators. Gas and diesel prices, grocery prices, inflation readings that capture more than just energy, consumer confidence, and whether hiring stays steady or begins to soften. Those will tell us whether the U.S. is facing a painful but manageable period, or whether the economy is sliding into something closer to stagflation. Either way, the ripple effects from Hormuz are already there, and they're reshaping the economic landscape in real time. And to put a real stamp on this, a piece in The Hill recently appeared entitled, "The Death of the American Dream is Now Official." What's striking about this piece isn't just the argument that the American dream is collapsing under debt, it's the timeline. Because when you lay it out, you realize this didn't happen overnight, this was decades in the making. The story really starts in the post-World War II boom. That was the golden age of the American dream. Rising wages, affordable housing, strong unions, and a system where one income could support a family. You didn't need debt to survive. Debt was optional. Things begin to shift in the 1970s. Wages stagnate, but costs, especially housing, education, and healthcare, start climbing. And instead of fixing that imbalance, the system adapts in a different way. It introduces debt as the solution. Credit cards expand, student loans explode, mortgages become more complex. The dream doesn't disappear, it just gets financed. By the 2000s, that model hits a breaking point with the 2008 financial crisis. That moment exposed something fundamental. The American dream wasn't built on stable income anymore, it was built on borrowed money. And when the debt structure cracked, millions lost homes, jobs, and savings. But here's the key part of the timeline that the article emphasizes. After 2008, we didn't actually fix the system, we doubled down on it. Today you've got an economy where, as broader data shows, huge portions of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, struggling just to cover basic costs. And at the same time, debt isn't just common, it's required. Student debt to get a job, mortgage debt to have a home, credit debt just to stay afloat. Surveys show around 70% of Americans carry some form of debt, and many feel overwhelmed or stuck. So the timeline tells a bigger story. The American dream didn't just decline, it was re-engineered. It shifted from a system based on rising wages and shared prosperity to one sustained by borrowing and financialization. And that's the significance. Because when a system depends on debt to function, it creates a kind of permanent instability. You can keep things going for a while, stretch payments, refinance, take on more credit, but eventually the math catches up. Even policymakers are warning about a slow, grinding debt crisis that erodes growth and living standards over time rather than collapsing all at once. So what we're really looking at isn't just a debt problem. It's a structural transformation of the economy. The American dream used to mean getting ahead. Now for a lot of people, it just means staying afloat. So the American dream didn't die, it got put on a payment plan, and now the bill is due. In other updates, first on the union busting front, Apple is facing a new labor complaint after a union alleged the company unlawfully discriminated against workers at its first unionized U.S. store in Towson, Maryland, according to reporting by Engadget. The complaint, filed with the NLRB by the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, claims Apple treated unionized employees differently from non-unionized workers when it decided to close several retail locations, requiring the Towson workers to reapply for jobs rather than transfer. Union leaders argue that Apple is denying union-represented workers the same opportunities it's giving to others, and doing so because these workers chose to organize, calling the move discrimination and retaliation for union activity. Apple has denied the allegations, saying it followed the terms of the collective bargaining agreement, which says it governs what happens when a store closes and does not guarantee transfers unless a new nearby location opens. The company stated it strongly disagrees with the claims made and plans to present its case to federal labor regulators. And the dispute adds to a growing list of labor challenges for Apple as unionization efforts expand within its retail workforce, with the Towson store unionized in 2022, serving as a major test case for how the company handles organized employees compared to its largely non-union workforce. And Amazon spent more than $26 million on anti-union consultants in 2025, marking what federal filings show as the largest such expenditure by a U.S. employer in a single year. The spending, disclosed through reports to the U.S. Department of Labor, involved hiring multiple firms that specialize in helping companies counter union organizing efforts, with hundreds of payments averaging over $56,000 each, more than the annual pay of some of the warehouse workers. Labor experts describe the scale of the spending as huge, noting that it likely understates the total cost because it does not include additional expenses such as anti-union legal work. The report highlights Amazon's ongoing efforts to resist unionization campaigns across its warehouses, delivery networks, and other operations, as organizing efforts by groups like the Teamsters and other unions continue to expand. Meanwhile, the union effort at Chipotle has ended after failing to secure a contract, highlighting the difficulty of sustaining unionization in the U.S. restaurant industry. Workers at a Michigan location had voted to unionize in 2022, but after more than 3 years of negotiations, no agreement was reached. Eventually, the Teamsters Union formally withdrew, stating it officially withdraws and disclaims interest in representing the employees. Because of this withdrawal, the company is no longer required to recognize or bargain with the union. The effort had been notable as Chipotle's only unionized U.S. restaurant, showing how rare such organizing successes are and how difficult they are to maintain. Of course, there are allegations that Chipotle engaged in anti-union behavior during negotiations, including claims it withheld raises and discouraged organizing. The company later settled with regulators, though it maintained, quote, "We believe that we've acted lawfully at all times." Another example of the steep challenges workers face even after successfully voting to unionize, especially when a first contract cannot be secured. Moving to a very telling reflection of capitalism in general, 5 years after New York State legalized recreational cannabis under the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, you'd expect a stable, functioning marketplace, legal weed, licensed shops, opportunities for small business owners, especially those the state promised would benefit most. Instead, what we have is a backlog, a massive one. According to a recent CBS News New York report on the cannabis license backlog, thousands of applicants have been waiting years for approval to open up shop. Let that sink in. Years. And this isn't happening in a struggling industry. New York's cannabis market's already generated roughly $3.3 billion in sales. Billions. The money is flowing. The demand is there. The infrastructure, at least for those already inside the system, is working. So what's the problem? On the surface, it's bureaucracy, lawsuits, regulatory delays. And sure, that's part of it. But if you stop there, you miss the bigger picture. Because what you're really looking at is capitalism doing exactly what it's designed to do. Everyone involved sees this as a chance to cash in. The state sees tax revenue, hundreds of millions of dollars. Regulators see a system they can control and pace. Existing businesses see limited competition as a way to maximize profit. Even illegal operators see an opening, because when legal access is bottlenecked, the underground market thrives. And then there are the applicants, thousands of them, who aren't just waiting for paperwork, they're waiting for a shot at survival, a shot at upward mobility. Many of them were explicitly told this market would be there, especially through equity programs meant to repair harm from past drug laws. Beck Hickey is one of about 3,000 people who applied through the state for a dispensary license back in 2023, and whose applications are pending approval from Albany. Quote, "I was really excited about starting something new in an industry that was new," she said. "They gave us a lot of hope that it was going to happen, so I sort of kept moving forward. I had investors ready, but because the application wasn't even being reviewed, the investors felt uncomfortable and, left." John Kagia, acting executive director of the New York State Office of Cannabis Management, said his department is getting through applications as fast as they can. Quote, "We're committed to continuing to do this work and ensure that the folks who want an opportunity to participate in this market get the chance to get a bite at this apple," he said. In the meantime, the state's no longer accepting applications for dispensary licenses. The executive director said the state aims to get through the backlog of thousands of applicants from 2023 in the next few months, but they don't have a timeline for when they'll reopen for applicants. So here's the contradiction. Capitalism doesn't distribute opportunity based on fairness. It distributes it based on control, scarcity, and profit. So a backlog isn't just a failure, it's also a filter. Every delay means fewer competitors entering the market at once. Every licensing slowdown protects those already positioned to make money. Every regulatory hurdle raises the cost of entry, financially and psychologically. So while billions are being made, workers and small applicants are stuck waiting for permission to survive, and that's the real story of this economy. Now let's talk about the fight back. Employees at Hachette Book Group have launched what organizers are calling the largest unionization campaign in U.S. trade publishing history, joining the News Guild CWA through the Hachette Workers Coalition. The effort includes hundreds of workers, spanning offices and remote employees across the U.S. and Canada, who have signed cards to form a union in order to secure better benefits, protections, and rights for workers, as well as increased equity, transparency, and agency in the workplace. Workers are demanding a livable wage, regardless of location, improved working conditions, limits on workload hours, a clear grievance process, and protections related to AI and diversity policies. Organizers argue the campaign is a response to long-standing industry issues, saying employees have faced substandard working conditions, overwhelming workloads, and compensation not commensurate with the company's success. In statements, workers criticized a publishing model driven by profit, with one noting they reject our current industry model, describing it as focused on unsustainable profit-driven growth, while workloads increase and pay and career opportunities stagnate. The union drive builds on years of internal organizing and activism at the company and is framed by workers as an effort to reshape both Hachette and the broader publishing industry into a more sustainable and equitable system. And more than 100 developers working on the online version of Magic the Gathering at Wizards of the Coast have announced plans to unionize with the CWA, citing issues such as layoffs, return-to-office policies, AI use, workloads, and career advancement. The effort is backed by a supermajority of workers who are seeking voluntary recognition while also filing for a formal election. A key catalyst was a mandate, as one designer explained, that workers hired remotely must move to Seattle or lose their job, a prospect that's left a lot of us spooked. Employees also expressed frustration with management's lack of responsiveness, arguing that they just aren't working with the people who are on the ground level, making unionization our best effort to try and rectify that. Regarding AI, one engineer says it has consistently shown worse results and harms the end product. Workers warn that without changes, policies like the return-to-office mandate could drive away talented staff, emphasizing that unionization is the only thing that's going to save the games industry. The company and its parent Hasbro had not responded publicly at the time of the report. In strike action, more than 4,000 graduate student workers at Harvard went on strike a few weeks ago over a year of stalled contract negotiations, arguing their pay lags behind peer institutions like MIT and Stanford and fails to keep up with Boston's high cost of living. The union says many workers earn around $50,000 or far less for teaching roles, while student workers at peer institutions receive higher pay and are demanding a minimum stipend of $55,000, along with raises tied to inflation and expanded benefits. The strike follows frustration over limited progress at the bargaining table, with workers also pushing for stronger protections against harassment and discrimination and better support for international students, including legal and immigration assistance. Union members argue that current wages have effectively declined in real terms and are not sufficient for living in Boston, with some positions paying so little that workers qualify for public assistance. At the same time, Harvard has offered smaller raises, around 10 to 11% over 4 years, which the union says falls short of what is needed. In related news, higher education unions across the northeastern U.S. have created the Amherst Compact, a first-of-its-kind agreement coordinated through Higher Education Labor United, or HELU, to align bargaining goals and strengthen collective action across campuses. Developed at a January 2026 summit, the compact brings together unions representing a wide range of workers, from faculty to custodial staff, across 9 states, with the aim of raising the floor for workers of all job categories and solidarity across job types and institutions. Rather than a binding contract, the compact serves as a strategic framework and organizing tool, encouraging unions to coordinate negotiations, support one another, and push for improvements in wages, job security, benefits, and working conditions, while also advancing broader goals like academic freedom and community well-being. Union leaders emphasize that the effort is both practical and aspirational, designed not only to influence upcoming contract negotiations across the region, but also to expand what workers and students believe is possible through collective action and cross-campus collaboration. And another meatpacking action in response to the same company as the last one in Greeley, Colorado, JBS. This time, union workers at Denver Processing, a meatpacking facility also owned by JBS, voted overwhelmingly to authorize a strike, citing alleged unfair labor practices and ongoing contract disputes. According to the union, UFCW Local 7, 97% of workers voted in favor of walking out, signaling strong support for potential strike action if negotiations fail. The union claims the company is violating federal labor law, engaging in bad faith bargaining, and preventing workers from securing a fair contract, while also accusing management of retaliation against union members involved in negotiations. JBS, which owns the facility, said it is disappointed by the workers' decision and maintains that it's offered wage increases and a one-time bonus, arguing that a strike may not achieve the union's goals. As of now, no official strike date's been announced, but the vote authorizes workers to walk off the job if talks don't produce an agreement, adding to ongoing labor tensions within the company's broader operations. Well, these workers down in Denver saw what their colleagues in Greeley just got: higher wages, cash bonuses, lower out-of-pocket costs, especially for healthcare and equipment, and improved time off, turning their strike into tangible economic and workplace improvements. So as to be expected, they said, why the fuck not us? And get this, Brazilian labor prosecutors have filed lawsuits against 5 firms over abuses in their supply chains, with JBS among those targeted, they said in a statement on Wednesday. Prosecutors are asking a court to order JBS to pay around 109 million reals, $23.78 million in damages in a case in Para State, where workers were found in slavery-like conditions in the company's supply chain. On to the ongoing entry-level job saga. What we're watching right now, really, is a generational shift in how work itself is understood. Because for a lot of new graduates, the plan isn't to find a career, it's to survive long enough to build one. One report found that many grads are taking any job they can get, but with no intention of staying. Why? Because they don't see these roles as stepping stones anymore. They see them as temporary footholds in an unstable system. AI anxiety is a major driver here. Graduates are rushing to get something on their resume while they figure out what jobs will even exist in a few years. And that anxiety isn't abstract, it's shaping decisions in real time. According to reporting from the Associated Press, About 70% of college students now believe AI threatens their future job prospects. That's not a fringe concern. That's the majority of the next workforce entering adulthood already questioning whether their education will even translate into employment. So what do? They pivot, they switch majors, they chase what they call AI-proof skills. Things like communication, critical thinking, human interaction. One student put it plainly, you don't just want technical skills anymore, you want the things that AI can't replace. But here's the problem. Nobody really knows what's AI-proof. So instead of clarity, what you get is chaos. And in that chaos, a third trend emerges, arguably the most telling one. Gen Z isn't just adapting to the system, they're abandoning it. Reporting from The Guardian shows that many young people are turning to entrepreneurship, not out of passion, but out of necessity. Traditional entry-level jobs are shrinking, hiring is slowing, and AI is cutting into the very roles that used to train new workers. So instead of climbing the ladder, they're building their own, freelancing, launching startups, stacking side hustles, doing anything that gives them control in a system that feels increasingly uncontrollable. And listen to how telling this is. One graduate expected a career in marketing and ended up taking a retail job while applying for work in the bathroom during shifts. That's not a failure of the individual, that's a failure of the pipeline. Because what used to be a structured transition from school to entry job to career is now completely fractured. Entry-level jobs demand experience. Experience requires opportunity, and opportunity is being automated away. So what you're left with is a generation that doesn't trust the promise. They don't trust that loyalty pays off or that degrees guarantee stability. And they definitely don't trust that the system has a place for them. So they treat jobs the same way the system treats them. Temporary, transactional, expendable. Take the job, learn what you can, leave. And if that sounds like a lack of commitment, it's not. It's a rational response to instability. Because if AI can replace your role, if employers won't train you, and if the ladder is disappearing, why would you stay? That's the real story here. It isn't about Gen Z being impatient. It's about a labor market that no longer offers a future, and a generation that knows it. It really is rough out there if you're on the fervent hunt for a livelihood, after all.
Okay, let's dive into this. Have you ever felt just completely wiped out by the simple act of looking for a job? Well, today's explainer is focusing on an absolutely crushing modern hiring phenomenon. It was recently explored in this really fascinating piece by The Guardian, and they finally put a name to a vicious loop that so many job seekers are trapped in right now. Because, honestly, understanding the mechanics of this loop, that's your very first step to actually escaping it. So think about this. What actually happens when you combine a spiritually unfulfilling job with an infinite scroll of unsuitable job ads? I mean, picture yourself stuck in a role that just doesn't pay the bills, or even worse, gives you zero sense of purpose. You want out, right? Obviously. So you turn to the internet, but instead of finding a lifeline, you're just staring down this endless void of listings. It's that deeply universal feeling of career dissatisfaction, and it really sets the stage for something much, much darker. Enter the new term the Guardian article introduces us to: doom jobbing. Basically, it's endlessly filtering through an infinite compendium of unsuitable, low-paying, or totally out-of-reach job listings during literally all of your free time. Imagine a recruitment website actively reaching right through your screen and just sucking the life out of you. You're spending your evenings, your weekends, constantly hitting refresh for roles that either demand qualifications you don't have or offer salaries you can't realistically survive on.
And this brilliantly illustrates a mechanism we're already way too familiar with, which is doom scrolling. You know, when you doom scroll, you sink into this rabbit hole of short-form content that just reinforces your worst perceptions of the world. Well, doom jobbing is the exact same mechanism, just applied to your livelihood. Sinking into a rabbit hole of job ads, reinforcing your worst perceptions of your career. It's the same addictive, deeply negative loop. We've just traded social media feeds for job boards.
At the core of this whole experience is one highly specific, really painful emotion: repeatedly thwarted hope. Like, this isn't just about being bored while you're browsing. You spot a job you actually like. You pour your precious time and energy into making this perfect application. You kind of let your guard down, maybe even picture yourself in that new office. And then, absolute silence. You don't even get an interview. It's just a cycle that breaks your heart over and over again. And the internal damage here is so real. As the Guardian piece rightly points out, your worst feelings about yourself are amplified, and your sense of self begins to erode. You start internalizing all these rejections. You start grappling with this completely false but super overpowering idea that you're just an unbelievable failure. It's deeply painful. And if you're going through this right now, I really want to validate that pain. It's a brutal cycle, directly attacking your self-worth.
Which leads us to one devastatingly simple truth from the piece. Doom jobbing will drain you of joy. Put the emphasis squarely on that word, doom, because it's literally a psychological breakdown happening in real time right in front of your glowing laptop screen. You aren't just looking for a job anymore, you're actively draining the joy from your daily life through this relentless exposure to rejection.
So, the really crucial question we have to ask is, why? Why is the job market so much worse now than it used to be? I mean, people have always looked for jobs, right? We used to just call it job hunting. But this explainer wouldn't be complete without validating the fact that, hey, this is not just in your head. You aren't doing it wrong. The landscape has fundamentally and structurally changed from what it was even a decade ago.
Because right now you are facing modern market hurdles that are stacking up against you in real time. Think about it. Greater competition from literally everywhere. Automated hiring systems instantly rejecting your resume based on invisible keywords. A massive surge of AI literally thinning out potential roles before human eyes even get a chance to see them. The odds are intensely stacked. The barrier to entry is higher, the applicant volume is massive, and you are fighting against algorithms just to be seen. It's a relentlessly hard market, and this overwhelming reality is exactly why it feels so impossible.
But let's look at breaking the loop, expert-backed strategies to escape the doom jobbing cycle.
Because we are absolutely not going to leave you stranded in the doom. The Guardian article consulted experts who offer very specific, actionable strategies to get out. So it's time to take your power back, step out of that algorithmic trap, and change your approach. Let's take a deep breath here and slow things down. Here is your concrete checklist out of the despair. Step 1, stop cookie-cutter applications. Step 2, drill down on specific roles. Step 3, set a time limit. And Step 4, reconnect with nature. This isn't just fluffy, feel-good advice, it's a tactical retreat from a system designed to overwhelm you. Let's break these down.
The very first massive shift you need to make is to stop blitzing arbitrary jobs. Put all your focus and energy into a handful of roles you really want. Just stop the mass applying. When you focus entirely on a few high-quality applications, your submission actually stands a much better chance of being noticed by a real human. Now let's be totally honest here. As the article notes, the eventual disappointments might still be huge, but it's a far healthier, far more effective starting point than just throwing your resume into the void 100 times a day.
And here is your essential containment protocol. Set a hard time limit to stop being sucked into a pit of despair. You have got to treat job boards with the exact same caution and skepticism that you use for doom-scrolling social media. Give yourself 30 minutes, maybe an hour tops. But when that timer goes off, you close the tab. You have to physically cap the amount of time this activity is allowed to drain from your personal life.
Finally, and honestly this might be the most important part, you need to step away from the screen. Go outside, reconnect with nature, and just remember that life is a beautiful thing. Look, I know it sounds incredibly simple, maybe even a little cliche, but when your entire sense of self is tied to a digital rejection letter from a no-reply email address, you really just need to go touch a literal tree. You have to gently remind your brain that there's a vast, physical, beautiful world out there that has absolutely nothing to do with your employment status. So, I want to leave you with this final provocative challenge. Are you ready to log off the job boards, enforce your time limits, and reclaim your sense of self-worth today? The system is flawed, and sure, the algorithms are ruthless, but your joy and your time, those belong entirely to you. You have the power to break this vicious loop right now. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and just remember, your career is only a part of your life, not the entirety of your worth. Until next time, stay curious and stay focused.
So let's say you're generally navigating and doing fairly well, all told, but have you ever looked at your life and thought, on paper, things are going fine, so why do I still feel unsatisfied? You're not alone. A lot of modern unhappiness isn't about being lazy or ungrateful. It's usually a sign that something is out of balance. One of the simplest ways to understand that imbalance comes from an old but surprisingly useful idea, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a theory in psychology. It argues that there are 5 stages of human needs that motivate our behavior. Abraham Maslow proposed his theory in 1943 after studying what he called exemplary people, such as Albert Einstein or Eleanor Roosevelt. First, there are physiological needs, such as the need to breathe, eat, drink, or sleep. The moment we get enough of that and we feel awake and our bellies are full, we get motivated by the next thing. Now we want safety. We try to earn money, build up resources, and look for shelter that protects us against dangers. Once we are satisfied and feel safe, we have time to think about what we want next. At stage 3, we seek love and belonging. We desire to be close to family and friends, belong to a society, or join a gang. But the moment we feel completely part of a group, we already wish to be a little different than the rest. At stage 4, we look for esteem, self-confidence, and respect from our peers. We want to be someone. If we have money, we buy a fancy watch. If we have a brain, we write or think or work a lot. Motivation to perform and compete is now at its highest. Students, sportsmen, and inventors excel. Neil Armstrong even flew to the moon. Only if we breathe and drink and eat and sleep enough, and we feel safe and part of a group and still special, only then can we reach level 5, self-actualization. Now we can relax, be creative, accept facts for what they are, give back or do whatever we want. No more pressure, unless of course there is trouble below. If you are a leader and believe in the theory, use it. First, make sure everyone has eaten well. Then make them feel safe and help them belong to a group. Once they feel they belong, they are ready to stand out and excel.
Now, people often criticize Maslow because real life isn't a neat staircase where you finish one level and permanently move on to the next. And that's fair. But large-scale research still supports the core point. These needs are different. They matter in distinct ways, and they each predict well-being. In one major study spanning tens of thousands of people across more than 100 countries, meeting needs like security, belonging, and respect each independently related to feeling more satisfied and experiencing more positive emotions. And here's a key detail that's easy to miss. Higher needs don't just erase lower ones. You don't graduate from needing safety because you're chasing purpose. You don't stop needing belonging because you're focused on personal growth. When people feel stuck or chronically unfulfilled, it's often because they're pouring energy into one layer while another layer quietly collapses underneath them. So today I want to walk through 3 common ways we accidentally undermine our own happiness. They map neatly onto 3 parts of Maslow's model: safety, belonging, and esteem. And as we go, I want you to keep asking yourself a gentle question. What layer might I be neglecting right now? First, we underestimate how much safety matters, even for big dreams. In a lot of modern culture, especially in the West, ambition gets applause. Stability, not so much. We celebrate the leap, the hustle, the reinvention, the constant leveling up. And of course, ambition can be healthy. But Maslow's point was that safety isn't optional. It's fundamental. Safety means things like financial predictability, health security, in a general sense that tomorrow won't suddenly fall apart. When that foundation is shaky, your nervous system notices, even if your resume looks impressive. You can be successful and still feel on edge because the body doesn't care about your achievements if it doesn't feel secure. Research backs this up. Studies on financial scarcity show that when people feel economically insecure, it consumes attention and mental bandwidth. Your mind gets pulled towards short-term problem solving, and it becomes harder to plan, focus, or make thoughtful long-term decisions. It's not a character flaw, it's a cognitive biological response to instability. And it's also not just about how much money you make. What often predicts well-being is perceived security. Do you feel safe? Do you feel like you can breathe? For many people, income influences that, but the real driver again is the sense of stability itself. That's why so many high achievers try to pursue self-actualization while running on poor sleep, chronic anxiety about money, or on a schedule that stretched past the limit. They call it chasing a dream, but a lot of times it's burnout wearing a motivational quote as a disguise. If you're constantly exhausted or keyed up while working toward goals that should feel meaningful, it may not mean you chose the wrong goals. It may mean you're trying to build a higher life on an unsteady base. Sometimes the most productive thing you can do for your growth is surprisingly unglamorous. Create more stability. Stabilize your finances where you can. Protect your sleep. Reduce the chaos. Put supports in place. The ground has to hold you before you can climb. Second, we downplay belonging, even though we're more connected than ever. Maslow didn't place it near the top like a bonus. He put it right in the middle because humans are social by design. Belonging isn't a luxury item, it's a need. Most of us understand that loneliness can affect mental health, but what's more startling is how much it affects physical health too. Large research reviewers have found that social isolation and loneliness are linked to a higher risk of early death, with an impact comparable to heavy smoking. And in some analyses, the harm of isolation is even stronger than the risk associated with obesity or not exercising enough. So why does this sneak up on people now? Because modern life makes it easy to look socially active without actually feeling connected. Remote work can shrink day-to-day interactions. Social media can create constant visibility but not much intimacy. And an achievement-focused culture can push us toward competition over connection. The result is this weird modern paradox. You can be in constant contact and still feel deeply alone. And when belonging is missing, the higher goals start to feel strangely hollow. Success can feel isolating instead of fulfilling. Motivation starts to crack more easily. You can reach milestones and still think, okay, now what? Because there's no shared joy, no sense of being known, no social reinforcement that makes your effort feel human and worthwhile. It also helps to remember that belonging isn't the same thing as popularity. It's not about collecting followers or being impressive in a room. It's about having real relationships where you feel accepted, supported, and understood. Without that, even wins can feel strangely quiet. If you've been feeling detached lately, consider this. You might not need a new productivity system. You might need more genuine connection, more time with people you can relax around, more honesty in your relationships, more spaces where you're not performing. Third, we outsource our self-esteem to external validation. In Maslow's model, esteem sits just under self-actualization. It has two sides, internal self-respect and confidence, and also recognition from other people. In a balanced life, esteem supports growth. It gives you the courage to try, to learn, to keep going. But here's where many of us get trapped. We tie up our worth to unstable metrics. Likes, views, comments, promotions, productivity, appearance, status. The problem isn't that these things feel good. The problem is when they become the foundation of how you decide whether you matter. Research on social comparison online shows a clear emotional cost. The more people compare themselves on social media, the more likely they are to experience depressive symptoms and lower self-esteem. And when your self-worth depends on online feedback, your mood becomes easier to shake because you're constantly waiting for the next signal from the outside world telling you how to feel about yourself. And when self-worth depends on external success, it often brings anxiety, defensiveness, and emotional volatility. And from a Maslow-style perspective, it makes sense. How can you steadily grow into your fullest self if your esteem is anchored to something you can't control? Algorithms change, trends shift, people's attention moves on. A small setback starts to feel massive, not because it's objectively catastrophic, but because it threatens your identity. So here are a couple of questions worth sitting with. When you aren't achieving, do you still feel okay about who you are? When you hit a plateau, does it feel disappointing or does it feel like you're becoming irrelevant? When something doesn't work out, do you feel sad or do you feel diminished? If setbacks feel like a personal threat, it might be a sign that your goals have become tangled up with approval. You may be chasing validation more than meaning, even if you don't intend to. The good news is that building eternal esteem doesn't mean you stop caring about progress. It just means your ambition becomes steadier. When confidence comes from within, you can take risk without collapsing if they don't pay off immediately. You can be motivated without being fragile. When you zoom out, the takeaway is simple but powerful. Fulfillment isn't about endlessly climbing upward. It's about balance across the layers that support a good life. So if you're feeling dissatisfied, your next step might not be aim higher. It might be to check the foundation. Do I feel safe enough to relax? Do I feel connected enough to feel supported? Do I respect myself even when I'm not performing? Because when safety, belonging, and a stable sense of self-worth are in place, the higher pursuits, meaning, creativity, growth, and contribution, they don't just look good, they actually feel good too. And that statement connects pretty directly to the core themes I've been building in this podcast, especially around unions, capitalism, and the lived experience of workers, of course. At its surface, it's describing something close to Maslow's hierarchy. When people's basic needs, safety, belonging, and self-worth are secure, they're able to access higher-level human experiences like creativity, meaning, and contribution. But in a labor-focused context, that idea becomes less abstract and more political. So, of course, safety isn't just emotional, it's material. It's job security, predictable schedules, safe working conditions, and not living one paycheck away from crisis. Belonging isn't just social, it's collective. That's where unions, solidarity, and workplace culture come in. And self-worth is deeply tied to dignity at work, whether people are treated as replaceable inputs or as human beings whose labor actually matters. So the statement reinforces a central argument to which I often circle back. When capitalism undermines those foundations through precarious work, low wages, or constant insecurity, it doesn't just create economic hardship, it also suppresses the very things that make work feel meaningful in the first place. In other words, the higher pursuits, creativity, growth, contribution, aren't luxuries that exist after economic stability. They're outcomes that depend on it. And from a labor perspective, that flips the usual narrative on its head. Workers aren't asking for comfort instead of ambition. They're arguing that without stability, ambition itself gets choked off or distorted into survival mode. Well, that's it for this episode. Thanks for watching, and to my audio people, thanks for listening. Please like and share so I can get this message out to more of our brothers and sisters, and hit that subscribe button. I'll see you next week. Solidarity always.